You're listening to the Yeshiva of Newark at IDT podcast. I'm your host and curator, Rabbi Kivlevitz, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Clear the aisles, the Projectionist has Semicha. Hi, I'm here with Kolakowski, and today we're actually going back to a place that Yitzchak, it didn't really shape or form you in any way other than perhaps what you saw. What?
Well, I lived there. I had a few kids there that were born there.
Okay, right. All right. Yes, you were definitely a Richmond person for a while, and you had your children there. But you weren't the son of the South like I was. Now, again, I always tell people I'm more from southern Poland than I am from the southern part of the United States, having been raised in a European home and speaking Yiddish growing up. But I definitely was exposed to much of what it's like to live in the South, having gone through, although it was a Hebrew day school, but a curriculum that was demanded by the state of Tennessee, and just in general, driving my bike around neighborhoods of the South, knowing what sort of city I lived in, and the uniqueness of what it was to and how the South was so different than the rest of the United States, and nothing like really. It's got the and this is really part of what we want to talk about today, the version of the South that the Hollywood and a lot of television shows were projecting. I remember watching the Andy Griffith show and noting to myself, well, Andy Griffith seems to have a Southern accent, but I don't think Don Knotts does. That's not the way people in the South talk. And B definitely didn't talk that way, and neither did Floyd. So I think, besides not getting the accents, there was also, I always felt, an over-exaggeration, a sense of seeing the South as a number of just the Southerners were grotesque losers that basically needed to be made fun of, even though despite Gone with the Wind and other films that sort of lionized the old great South, I think more often than not, whether it was Rock Hudson and Pillow Talk or anything like that, being a Southerner usually meant sometimes sly, untrustworthy, but most of the time foolish and backward in many ways. So tonight we want to talk about two films that really emphasize what Southern life was about. One comedic, the other I would call a black comedy, with very important religious undertones, and in fact, extremely serious ones about the nature of Catholic Christianity and how it differs, perhaps, if we can talk about it, from many principles that we hold dear. So let's start with the lighter side of the South in a film that you felt had some significance for you and your family. So go ahead.
Well, I don't know how much significance, but it's I remember seeing this movie many years ago, and I watched it now. It's in the public domain, and it's the thing that's most curious about it is that a lot of people are familiar with the character from the Looney Tune cartoons called Foghorn Leghorn, which was the big rooster everybody knows with the Southern accent, and he's like, I declare, and he's always, he has all these very exaggerated mannerisms, and what most people don't know is that character was actually a parody of another character, a radio character from the Fred Allen Show, which was, I know, my Baba Allah Sholem was a big fan of Fred Allen. She's, there was, there's this feud supposedly between Fred Allen and Jack Benny throughout the years, and she was staunchly in Fred Allen's team, my Baba. But in any event, one of the recurring characters on the show was Senator Beauregard Claghorn, and the Foghorn Leghorn character that again became much more famous was really a parody, as many, we know many cartoon characters, like we mentioned before, how Top Cat was Phil Silvers, and the Simpsons made a whole reference to that in one episode of how cartoons are just rip-offs of parodies of other.
Was definitely true for the Warner Brothers cartoons. I mean, the Warner Brothers cartoons who introduced Foghorn Leghorn, they first of all, even their Porky Pig was a ripoff of a Disney pig that they had sort of like, boulderized, so to speak. And Daffy, although it doesn't really sound like Donald, was also basically, sort of ripping them up. But you're right, they Warner Brothers did great imitations. Of course, they had Mel Blanc and other incredible voice artists. I think Mel Blanc was the voice for Foghorn Leghorn. I believe so. So you definitely.
And Mel Blanc often would appear on the
yes.
Jack Benny. He'd appear on the Jack Benny show. I think one of the funniest bits that I'd ever seen with Jack Benny. It just cracks me up every time I see him. Mel Blanc shows up and he says, "Oh, I remember you. We went to high school together in Waukegan, and you still play that fiddle, And he's like, what are you doing with your life?" So then Jack Benny tells Mel Blanc, "I'm the voice of Porky Pig," and he cracks himself up. Jack Benny is always so deadpan and everything.
Look, I want to tell you something. Even though your grandmother is a big Fred Allen fan, Fred Allen was not able, let's be honest, to make the jump to television or a film that Jack Benny was able to. Fred Allen, right? I mean, you see him on What's My Line,
but he wasn't.
Fred Allen is a big Balkishran, and Fred Allen is quick. He's caustic. He's not Don Rickles, but he can definitely use his sharp wit to sort of almost eviscerate someone in terms of what he was about. But I don't believe he was able to have that type of chen that you'd want to watch him and see him in that way. And so let's be honest. A lot of the radio programs, just like podcasts. The reason why they were hits were in large part due to these ancillary characters that you wanted to hear from, and people that could do interesting voices and mimic things that were going on. And as you said, the Senator Claghorn was a typical Southern, and I don't know, clearly a sort of
very exaggerated, very, very exaggerated. A Southern caricature, but lovable and amiable. He wasn't presented as some kind of certainly not in a negative, sleazy way at all. He's very lovable, but somewhat of a dunce, somewhat of a.
So really, on the cusp of a television that's still not yet made it, but clearly the idea of using radio for mining radio programs for film. This film in 1947 decided to take that Senator Beauregard Claghorn, who was so popular on the Fred Allen show, in the hope they could build a whole film around that character, and that's the film.
This was something they'd done. Lum and Abner, another Southern caricature type of a show. There was a whole series of Lum and Abner movies that I got a kick out of those. I haven't seen them in a little while, but they're really, really out there, really far out movies. The Lum and Abner. I mean, like the show was. Lum and Abner was in a way a forerunner to shows like Green Acres and Andy Griffith, but it was again much more exaggerated.
Mm-hmm. So you're thinking that maybe It's a Joke, Son was floated as maybe a possible series of films that would be, like we talked about Andy Hardy and Dr. Kildare or whatever. So this was also, they were maybe wondering if this film would give enough box office and interest that they could somehow, Kenny Delmar. Now, was Kenny Delmar you're not sure if he was the radio voice or he was the radio voice?
I think he was. It sounds just the same, and it's not.
And Kenny Delmar, his history. I mean, again, if you look at his filmography and if you go to the IMDb website, you see that he did a lot of voice work. That was one of the things that he was, and in Underdog and many other sorts of cartoons that were that allowed him to be this. I think he was the narrator on Tennessee Tuxedo, which is one of my favorite cartoons. Although again, Don Adams did not. I don't know why he was called Tennessee Tuxedo, Don Adams. This is a guy. This was Maxwell Smart. This is Inspector Gadget. That's who Tennessee Tuxedo was. Not too much Tennessee there, but Claghorn was sort of like an all-encompassing Southerner, right? It was Texas, New York, Texas, right? I'm sorry, Texas, North Carolina, Tennessee, all together in some fictional Southern place. So I guess the plot isn't that important, but it somehow they're worried about Claghorn winning re-election. Is that what's going on? Is that the basic plot of the film?
It wasn't even a re-election. He was actually running against some sort of a carpetbagger senator who had been there for a long time. They had asked him to give a speech in support of him. They offered him some money. He was having, excuse me, he was having some money problems, and they offered him in the beginning of the movie some money to give a speech for this carpetbagger senator, who was really just an empty suit, really just a puppet to really corrupt people who, kind of along the lines of what we were talking about with in Wilson, the kind of bosses that ran politics in New Jersey in the turn of the century. This is how it was presented, that this guy who kind of slept through his.
So basically they want him to run against. He gets pushed in to run against his wife, right?
Well, his wife wants to run against this carpetbagger. She's pushed to run against the carpetbagger, and then the carpetbagger's campaign, and he had some money issues, and the same money that they both made on the mint julep farm, they both spent, so they had to make up that money, and they came up with an idea that if he would run against his wife, it would split the ticket and guarantee that the incumbent would win again. So therefore, the incumbent gave him twice as much money as he needed in order to run against his wife, and then he realized he can't just sell out like this. He's going to actually be a viable candidate, which leads him to being kidnapped and his life being threatened. So it's a silly movie, but it has a very serious things. But one of the scenes when his wife is nominated by the Daughters of Dixie to run, they're presenting themselves very much feminist, first wave feminists, and part of the old first wave feminism was prohibition. So they were recommending that maybe we should bring prohibition back. This was, maybe about 15 years after prohibition ended. And then what happened was that unwittingly, there was a little boy who was collecting for the newspaper who helped him put together the punch, and he didn't realize what he thought was grape juice was all kinds of alcohol. He made some very strong drink, and these women who all said, they would never let alcohol pass their lips, all got very drunk, and they were giggling, and it was a very funny scene. So it's
So basically, it does talk a little bit about the usual tropes of what American politics had become, right? Dirty, underhanded stuff, backroom things. It sort of gives a little bit of a sort of a Mr. Smith Goes to Washington type of idealism, right? Does when he wants to win for the right reasons, or is it just that he's
for the right reasons? Yeah.
So they do, Beauregard does have some positivity, and
he's a very lovable, positive character. And he's a foil to his wife. Like one of the members of the cast who plays his daughter is June Lockhart, a young June Lockhart. We're used to her being a mother in Lost in Space and in Lassie. and here she's a young woman, at marrying age. I guess this is what she did before she wound up lost in space, or
See,
having
and,
lost, whatever it is.
right, and does she present herself with somewhat of a Southern accent in the film?
She does, and she does a fairly good job with it. It doesn't sound that fake. But the
I
interesting
remember her.
thing,
I remember her as a Southern character when B. Bernadette passed away, or was very, very sick with cancer, and could not continue in the Petticoat Junction role. She was the head of the Shady Rest Hotel, and they brought in, after she died, they brought in June Lockhart.
Yeah, I remember. I know what you're talking about now.
Yeah,
that's
right,
correct.
right. And I remember. That she's from Lost in Space, and now she's here on Petticoat Junction. And again, I always thought Hooterville was somewhere in the South. I don't know. Yeah. It seems to me Hooterville had to be somewhere in the South. But once again, besides Pat Buttram, a clear Southern character, Mr. Haney, right, from Green Acres, I really was always disappointed, with this. What was, Ebb was a little bit of a Southerner from Green Acres. In generally Hollywood television programs, it doesn't make a difference. It's sort of like I was talking about National Velvet a couple of weeks ago. The South is an idea, a concept of Hicks, of hustlers, of backwardness, something to be a punchline for. It really doesn't make a difference. One or two people can hit the Southern accent. The others can sort of just fake it and limp along with it. But it wasn't like real truths about what was going on. And we know, Yitzchak, that the politics that were really happening in the 1940s and 50s in the South were toxic and difficult, and really in many ways shaped were the catalyst for the pushback that created the civil rights movement. So really, the film that you're talking about is really playing around in an area that not only did it have potential for real exploration, and I would say an Academy Award winning film that you might not have seen, which is called All the King's Men with Broderick Crawford. Mm-hmm. Is based on the Louisiana governor, Huey P. Long, and that is a film that I think is more true to the Southern mentality. I'm not sure if they got the ambiance correct, but that's a film about how the South was really a place not just for carpetbaggers, for the political machine, for people that wanted to do the right thing, but in some ways were constrained by the limitations of the prejudices of the people around them, and of the way things have always been done around here. The same sort of things that I think underlie why the South couldn't change.
That's why I experienced as a Rav in the South was the pushback was, which I guess that happens everywhere, but the real pushback is, you're trying to change things as they've been done, all these years. Who are you to change?
I think one of the things that people realize, they when they talk about, the Southern accent, it's so cute. There is a commonality that people who study. I'm not sure exactly what it's called, but how dialects and languages, and they'll tell you that there is a great, what is it called?
Linguistics, yeah.
Well, I know what linguistics is. What I mean is that
part of that. It's
but people will tell you that the way Southerners pronounce things is actually closer to the way the Old English pronunciation in England is.
Or actually how it was, meaning the English accent changed over the years. People often wonder, when did the Americans lose the English accent? And it's what I heard was it's the opposite, that England made up a new accent, and that the American accents are more the original.
But the Southern accent is closer to the original accent of the way people spoke in England. And we know, again, I don't understand it exactly, but what I do know is in the mentality was much more similar. The idea that, the gentry, the sense of aristocracy, the way things happen. England, and that's part of the reason why during the Civil War, of course, despite the fact that slavery had been outlawed by England way before the United States did, England was doing a tremendous amount of commerce with the southern states, as you know.
Right.
And as the war was beginning, despite the fact that Britain was clearly anti-slavery, but they really felt an affinity to persons from the South. And again, as you know, Virginia, which is where you were from, was considered, I think at one time had a nickname as the birthplace of presidents. Isn't it called that or something like that?
Yeah, there were more, I think, even still to today, there were more presidents that were born in Virginia than in any other state.
Right. And we know part of the reason that Washington, D.C. was chosen as the capital was to somehow assuage Southern fears of everything being centered in the North. So, I was just in Baltimore. Believe me, Baltimore, many areas just outside of Baltimore, you could think that you were in Mississippi, some places. So, the South was.
What I was saying about June Lockhart's character is she really loves her father, and she's kind of, she sees her mother as not showing proper respect to her father, that her father is someone who deserves respect, even though the mother character is much more put together and seems like someone probably who deserves more respect. And it's certainly a theme that they bring up there of how, the other Senator Lee, who they were running against, he said his backers said there's no way that you could beat a woman, because in the South a woman is an institution. You can't, if a woman runs, she's guaranteed to win. And that was the only way, to kind of split up the vote again, was to have her own husband run against her. And so June Lockhart was constantly, giving her mother a bit of a hard time, like, why do you treat Dad so poorly? Maybe if you were a little bit nicer to him, things would be a little bit better. And in the end, she kind of learns that lesson too. So it's
well, yeah, and remember, June Lockhart was an unknown. We know her from our perspective because we are geeks from the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, or wherever you're from. But the point is that, but Una Merkel, who plays her mother, was actually probably the biggest name on that on the playlist of who was in that film. She, of course, was part of Hollywood's golden era. She had been, I think she'd been in a number of silent films, and she's actually the closest to a Southerner in this whole movie. She was born in Covington, Kentucky, which is basically Cincinnati. I don't know if you know that. It's basically a suburb of Cincinnati, but she grew up in the South. So I would assume she was able to get the Southern accent pretty spot on. I think Una Merkel, I guess she has to play sort of the character that needs to learn her lesson, as opposed to was Kenny Delmar, who plays Beauregard. He sort of does he change at all? Does he go through any growth other than discovering some sort of sense of American integrity, or do you think he's basically the same fellow the whole time?
Yeah, no, he basically the same throughout most of the movie, with the exception of that, earlier in the film he was. It's strange because at the beginning of the film the whole thing was that he would not sell out, and then he kind of sells out out of desperation, and then he regrets that he, so there is a slight. It's not really a character arc because he really just returns. It's more almost really a full circle that he realized that he was mistaken in his thought that he could sell out in order to just because of his financial woes. And the interesting thing, and this is something people have been commenting on The Simpsons a lot recently, is that he lives in this big beautiful estate, and yet he has all these financial problems. Which is, on one hand, it is realistic. I remember, going to Yeshiva in Queens with a lot of people from Great Neck, and the the Rosh Yeshiva would often mention that there are people in Great Neck in the big mansions who are on Tomchei Shabbos because they're trying to keep up with the Joneses or the Parnushas or whoever it is, and they really can't. And so this was also, I think, part of what he was experiencing was that trying to maintain this vision, which I think is also very much a Southern.
Very much so. The South, and there was this idea of, right, as much as we sometimes see, the Appalachia, or everybody's on welfare and living out of, tin, sort of little houses made out of tin or boxes. There was really this idea of the South, especially after the Civil War, that they were too proud, that they wouldn't take handouts. They didn't want to be treated as something less, and sort of not really, perhaps even owning up to the humbling that history had given them. I think that was part of the tragic aspect of the South. And in many ways, I think that's the reason why so many people are fascinated by it, because you have an old Southern Gothic mansion or something like that that's in disrepair. Once again, a very favorite trope of Hollywood about what the South is like. And I think that one of the things
about the alligator people, it's another movie that I think captures the South much more. I already did my movies, so
I will say, however, that just that this film does feature, as when I look on the IMDb page, the dog that I praised up ad leva shamayim. You might remember in our National Velvet show when I said the horse I wasn't so crazy about, but the dog was great. That dog was actually Daisy, who made a career in the Blondie films with Penny Singleton. And those films, which we talked about serials, and those are sort of like a bargain basement Andy Hardy film, but based again from the long running cartoon strip, in the newspaper, of course, Blondie and Dagwood, and I've seen a number of them. The acting is terrible. I mean, the acting is terrible.
But they're a lot of fun.
Right. And Daisy is great in all of them. I mean, she was, I don't know if Daisy was a he or a she, but that dog could steal any scene. And, Daisy is the Claghorn's dog as well, right? This. Right? So, in fact, she gets billing because everybody knew about Daisy. She was such a superstar. She lived to be quite old. She lived, I think, about almost 20 years. So she was really a canine superstar. So it might be worth your hour, and hopefully get a couple of chuckles, and you get a sense of what the Hollywood sense of the South was. Here's a little bit of a hook. Una Merkel, of course, had a bit role in a film that I think was, in many ways, broke the genre of what the detective film was about. In other words, it wasn't necessarily like Philo Vance or Solving the Crime or Mr. Moto or Charlie Chan. The adaptation of what was considered like one of the best detective stories that were written in the 20th century, Dashiell Hammett's The Maltese Falcon, was directed, and I think the screenwriter who had adapted it was John Huston, the son of a very important Hollywood actor who in the silent films in the 1920s was a very impressive leading man. And Walter Huston's son, John, learned from his father, learned from the area around him, and cast Una Merkel as Sam Spade's secretary in The Maltese Falcon. Of course, she was a very striking woman. I don't know, and that was part of the reason why the secretary who has ideas on the boss, and of course, the reason why The Maltese Falcon is so interesting is because it's not so much about solving the crime. It's really about the character study and the trauma that goes on between all of the main characters, especially Spade himself. And how the plot is really secondary to what it says about people about who they are. And I think this is part of what Huston did. Huston's films were from the Maltese Falcon and on. Not all of them were super classics, but they all dealt, I think, with, and I've talked about with you about what I think is one of the greatest films about greed, The Treasure of the Sierra Madre. And Huston, as I've mentioned when I talked about that film with you, was very, very adept at his use of actual locations. The Treasure of Sierra Madre was made in Mexico, and the use of Tampico and other spots, I think I've talked about how wonderful Huston was able to integrate them. Of course, they had to shoot many scenes on the Hollywood lot that weren't able to be done. But Huston was, again, a character into outsider characters. He also, in his films, made incredible use of locations, of actual locations, giving a person a sense that he was being transported to a certain place. Both of those things are on display in this film, which I think is probably in many ways, along with a film that came out at a couple of years earlier, Deliverance, two films that Hollywood made that I think come very close to at least capturing some truths about the South, even though they are both, in a way, horror stories of the South. Now, Deliverance maybe we'll deal with on a different time. The film I want to talk about is John Huston's Wise Blood from 1979. It is a film that is probably one of the most fealty. It has the greatest fealty to its source of almost any film I've seen. Now, again, you could probably dump the Harry Potter films in there as well, because of the millions of readers who are expecting to see all the same scenes that J.K. Rowling put on page. Here we're talking about a book that was written in 1952. It was probably being developed for a number of years beforehand by Mary Flannery O'Connor, known as Flannery O'Connor, a girl from a young woman from Midgenville, Georgia, and she was a Catholic in a Baptist environment, and the book has become an American classic. It's a required reading in many high schools and many colleges. It's considered, in a way, essential for understanding how Catholicism can survive and continue and meet the challenges of their skeptics. I have to tell you, again, after I saw the film, I went back to the source material. And I did a little bit of a deep dive into Flannery O'Connor and her importance. She is a writer that uses the South, Yitzchak, and all the stuff, the baggage about it, to treat the South as sort of like the wounded mortal who needs salvation but bristles against it. We know, although it was not really Catholicism that was dominant in the South, we know the South was drenched with Christian ideology, with Southern Baptist preachers who preached a very strong fire and brimstone type of religion. Besides the Baptists and Methodists and others that circulated in the South was also the basis of what we call revivalist religions, of religions that were not necessarily based specifically in Protestantism, but were sort of what we call the religions of evangelicals. We see them in the South, the mega churches that have developed from out of there. So this was the area that Flannery O'Connor was working with. And part of what she creates, this character of someone who is a child of a revivalist Baptist over-the-top preacher who's played in flashbacks by Huston. And she gives him a sort of androgynous sort of name, Hazel Motes, right? A mote, almost like a speck of what he feels like, because that is what his grandfather's made him feel like. His grandfather seems to have been a traveling preacher or an itinerant one, and he has been raised hearing about Jesus, hearing about salvation. He comes back in Flannery O'Connor's book. He seems to have been a World War II veteran, having seen the horrors of war. This film that was made in 1979, he's seemingly coming back from the Vietnam War. And he throws his army uniform in the trash, cashes the big army check that he got, seemingly because he was wounded in some way, although the film and the book don't really expand on that. But he gives him, without, really in sort of strange way, an unending amount of money, which I'm not sure why, that he spends throughout the film in the strangest possible manner. What he ends up doing is moving to a mid-sized city. In the film, it's Macon, Georgia. It was filmed entirely in Macon, Georgia. And this is where the film really, came to life for me, because although I was raised in Memphis, Tennessee, the areas of Memphis that I was raised in look, hauntingly similar to the downtown areas and the areas that are in Macon, Georgia, that Huston highlights. He ends up in this city in Macon, basically deciding at first to live a life of debauchery with a prostitute, but then he finds himself beyond his control becoming a preacher. But what sort of preacher is he? He's a preacher who preaches against Christ. He preaches against Jesus. He calls it the Church of Christ without Christ. So in other words, Jesus is there, but not there, and that there's no such thing as sin, and there's no such thing as the resurrection. There's no such thing as the world to come. There's no such thing as being guilty. Well, you would seem you don't have to say anything, but yet he preaches it and he screams it. And the actor that plays Hazel is Brad Dourif, who had an Academy Award nomination for playing Billy Bibbit in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. But then really made a career of playing, very much erratic, creepy people. He was, and if you look at the films that he's played, most of the people he's played have been very violent, upsetting type of characters. Brad Dourif. He in one of his best roles, if you can catch it, is in an episode of The X-Files, where he plays some Boggs, who is Lou. I forgot, a double name Boggs, who somehow has some sort of extrasensory perceptive powers that somehow that crack Scully. A very effective performance there, real creepy. But in this film, he plays a person in pain, a person who, despite himself, finds himself preaching against God, and yet he is attracted to other preachers and other people who are actually supposedly his opposite number. There is a Harry Dean Stanton, who you might know is a great character actor who's been in a number of wonderful films, and plays a preacher who wanted to blind himself and pretends that he's blind. The idea being that to really connect to God, to really get beatification, you need to suffer, and you need to take away the senses of this world. Again, a very much a Catholic perspective. It's not the Protestant perspective, but it's a perspective of a radicalism that the only way you could ever become beyond is to actually become one with the pain and suffering of Jesus. We're talking about the ancient ideas, not a flagellation, the ideas of sainthood being achieved by actually living a life of martyrdom, where you actually go together with Jesus completely. There is a preacher who professes himself to be that, and Hazel finds himself connected to it. He exposes him as a fraud at least for himself, but yet he's drawn to that idea. So as much as he's saying, I don't believe, he isn't just a cold atheist, despite himself. And despite everything that he's saying, as Shakespeare says, methinks he does protest too much. There's a number of other side characters. There's the preacher's nubile teenage daughter who it's clear is very much aroused just by the physical presence of Hazel's character. And in fact, throughout the film, Hazel, despite his sort of otherworldly looks, his passion and his intensity is a big turn on for the women. The women seem to like it. And again, part of what this shows you, and I think this is reflective even in the original text of O'Connor's book, is that the line of demarcation between sensuality and religious ecstasy is very thin. And we find that these two things are somehow melded together. Another theme that comes up in it's a very somewhat episodic movie is the love of a car. You know, Hazel goes to like the worst sort of used car lot and buys sort of a flashy looking 25-year-old vehicle that he at the top of his lungs he screams is a great car, and this is a great car, despite what all the garage mechanics are telling him, and he believes this car is his escape. And watching it, I realized that this is really, in many ways, the way O'Connor and Huston were talking about what America's, as you know, love affair with the automobile, and this idea that if a man has a car, this could be his Aron HaKodesh to salvation. And he with religious fervor, he talks about like as if this car is the Esgalos Hashchina that he's part of. All the time, in fact, of course, denying that there is anything spiritual, and that he is a grotesque. The characters around him, I mentioned two of them. There's another character who is an 18-year-old boy who just is looking for friends, who's finding even a southern city, a genteel southern city, doesn't really connect. He feels a disconnect to humanity. There is a pygmy that's found in a museum in the town near the zoo. That is somehow they break into this museum to capture this pygmy, a totem, which is somehow the Antichrist figure. The idea that there is somehow a being that represents from some primal world that they could somehow connect to and worship. And all of this is really stitched together and surrounded with what I thought was really true Southern figures. And Huston wants the film to be populated by actual characters who are non-actors who show up in Macon. And Huston enjoyed using them. He doesn't necessarily give them big parts to say, but you really believe you're in the South. What's strange to Yitzchak, though, is that the film, although the source material is 1952, the film is clearly, with interstate highways and other things around, it's clearly in the late 70s that the film is showing, and yet the characters are acting as if they're in some incredible Southern Gothic drama. At least the main characters are, and it's somewhat off-putting. But I think part of it, it really illustrates how the South perhaps has not really grown up, despite the fact that in the industrialization of the South has occurred. The South seems to be with interstate connected to all the rest of the country, but yet it still remains this wounded place that hasn't really perhaps risen above their original sin. The N-word is dropped consistently there by the main characters, indicating that sense of racism still permeates deeply every aspect of life in the South, which to me isn't so much about O'Connor's hatred of racism. She actually was known to write a lot of racist comments. It's more about the fact that that she understood it was ugly and but it wasn't necessarily this was a comment against racism. It was the fact that these people are in a way old beyond the trappings around them. They are in a way old souls. They are in a way looking for, although they don't realize that they will find salvation, whether they want to or not. And that is sort of like
the Universal monster movies. You can't figure out where is this taking place, because it's going between modern day and like these peasants, out in somewhere.
Right. That's right. Like, but here I think it is these characters that you're going to watch their arc. They are in a way non-historical characters. They represent sinners. They represent ultimate sin, growth. They represent a world that needs to be redeemed. And the fact that they're so strange is one of the reasons why that you are somehow fascinated by them. The film it's like it seems like an independent film because the camera sometimes is shaky, and yet you can't really stop looking at what's going on with these people and the strange things that they are saying. So it is what message? Again, obviously, we end up discovering God even when we are denying God, and that God is pushing us despite our demands and screaming that we hate God, and yet we are finding ourselves connected to him no matter what. What happens with Hazel is that he ends up attracting people to his non-message. And there's another huckster played by Ned Beatty, and you might know Ned Beatty from Network, from Deliverance as well. He was the one, of course, that was attacked in the woods in Deliverance. He also plays one of Luthor's henchmen in the original Superman film. So Ned Beatty is used to playing Southerners, and he plays a sort of a shifty preacher who wants to cash in. Now, what he ends up doing is he gets a homeless man when Hazel refuses to play ball with him. When Hazel refuses to team up with him for a couple of dollars because Hazel wants to be true and he has to be a true human being, what he does is he finds sort of a lookalike for Hazel in among some homeless people, dresses him up to look exactly like him, and then has him stand on a car that's somewhat similar to Hazel's Aron HaKodesh, and have him basically mouth pretty much the same inanities, but in order to pass the hat around, which Hazel refuses to do. Hazel refuses to take any money. He's just living off of his army pension. When Hazel sees that someone has sort of usurped his identity, Hazel follows this homeless person who's now driving this car that's also his double, and runs him off the road and runs him over. And basically, in his dying breath, this homeless man starts confessing his sins. In the last couple of minutes of his life, he confesses his sins to Hazel, who is the one who has killed him. Well, after that occurs, Hazel is able to find some lime from a hardware store, wherever he gets it, and he puts the lime into his eyes and blinds himself. And afterwards, Hazel, living in this boarding house with his landlady, begins to emulate the stigmata. He wraps barbed wire around his chest, cutting into himself in order for him to bleed every night. He walks on rocks. I mean, similar, of course, to the Gemara we know in Bava Metzia about what Reb Shimon wanted to do. But this was, again, classic. This is reliving Golgotha. This is reliving the, Christ's walk to death. And this is what the penance that he believes he needs to have for his life and maybe it's what he did in Vietnam, and maybe it's what he did living with these wanton women and lusting after them. and he wants to be blind and suffering. And again, the landlady becomes enamored of him. He's no longer just somebody who pays rent, and he doesn't have any money, but she is very she feels very close to him. And although she's probably about 25 or 30 years older, she says the only way he can stay is if he decides to marry her. When he hears this, is once again he's being drawn and being like a magnet for sensuality. Hazel decides to go out into a rainstorm, and he disappears for a number of days. She calls the police, and basically in a scene taken directly again from the novel, the police find him, under some sort of trestle in the town. He probably hasn't eaten, and he's blind. He's just perhaps only barely alive. The police bring him back to the boarding house. Now, in the book, it's clear that the policemen in the back of the car, they were so angry at him for some reason, just like Jesus on carrying the cross. They pelted him and basically break his neck or kill him. In the film, it isn't clear that he's dead, but the police bring him into the woman's boarding house. They place him on a bed, and in the last scene, you can see his hands are stretched out like Jesus on the cross. And she is talking to him as if he's alive. And of course, in the book, the very famous last lines of the book is, she saw the gleam of life in his eyes, once again indicating the idea of the resurrection. The movie doesn't zero in on his eyes. You just hear the landlady speaking to him and saying, yes, whatever you want, you'll be wherever you can live, wherever you want. And that's the way the film ends. Now, again, I spoiled it for people if they're interested in it. But again, here is a film that takes the South and turns it into the gospel, but turns it into a very Catholic version of the Gospels, and a version that I think that, again, you are familiar with Catholic theology. What I'm telling you is probably, I'm sure you've heard it and you know about it. What's interesting, again, is that people believe that O'Connor is important because she believed that we shouldn't be swamped in America by the Protestantism that seems to walk so hand in hand with the American ideal, the idea of materialism, of manifest destiny, of all the things that Protestantism has in terms of sort of like, streamlining Christianity for people, here in America. This is really a much more restrictive, demanding version of what a relationship to God is. And it's therefore very interesting that Huston, he makes this film. Huston was an atheist. He didn't believe in God. And he says, I made this film, and he says this film was a struggle for him, because in a way he sort of like was thinking, okay, does this film indicate that really there is a God power behind everything or not? And I think, I think in that way, the film is probably worth investigating as a way to tap into what might be, I wouldn't call it radical Christianity. I would call it more, the original Christianity that spread around the world, and how, as you say, it takes root in the South. A couple of quibbles about the film. The music by Alex North is really, to me, terrible. He basically takes themes like the Tennessee Waltz and other themes, and also a number of themes that are completely comedic, and really give the film a sort of a television type of feel to it that it doesn't deserve. I think that the soundtrack is all wrong, really, and Huston made the money. He made the film on very little money. He didn't use actors that were really such big name actors, although again, some of them, they're powerful performances. And I'm not sure exactly what was going on in terms of the rights for the film. I just want to say the last thing here is that I believe the film is interesting, but it's ultimately a failure because I believe what a filmmaker should do is distill the essence of the idea of the source material, but into very much cinematic terms, even if it means altering the ending, even if it means conflating characters. A film isn't meant to follow lockstep what the book was about. It's impossible. The interior aspect of a book means that it's meant to ruminate about and come back to hours and hours. A 2-hour film that this is can't possibly do that. So when you're just checking the boxes of what occurred, you're really setting yourself up for a challenge that's unnecessary. Another film that deals with sort of preachers in the South, and we've talked about it, Elmer Gantry, wisely zeroed in on only one section of the book, despite it's a 2.5-hour film. A much superior, again, Elmer Gantry is a much superior film to Wise Blood, but Wise Blood tells you really more about the nature of Catholic or original Christianity than Elmer Gantry does. And the characters are not, Burt Lancaster is never going to be confused with Brad the Riff. Brad the Riff plays it totally over the top with insanity, whereas Burt Lancaster is always in somewhat knowing what sort of scoundrel he really is. But again, Gantry and other films, again, Gone with the Wind is also an example, and that's the reason why Gone with the Wind was so long. It was such a long film because the book was so loved that it was sort of expected that there would be the film would do what the book had done. But again, I never read Mary Mitchell's original, but I do know liberties were taken. But those liberties, Yitzchak, are necessary. I think you lose what a book's plays are supposed to inspire filmmakers who have a different laboratory to deal with than the laboratory of an author, of using certain metaphors and certain terms and certain words of expression that take you to a certain place to mull over in your head. Whereas there's the gifts that are given to a filmmaker, and the ones that he supposedly can sharpen with his understanding of how to use mise en scene, to be able to use blackouts, to be able to use close-ups, to be able to use crane shots, to be able to give you POV or even split screens or other things like that. Those are gifts that a filmmaker is given and really should know how to use to distill what the idea, or at least how the idea of this book affects you. I think Huston is a very bright man, but I think he is operating here under the heavy weight of what everybody assumed Flannery O'Connor meant. And it's almost like, well, the only thing he could do is kowtow to her vision and basically follow it by the numbers. I think what he ends up doing is really short selling what he could do. He could have really still explored this character, but really not necessarily had all these other aspects, lifting almost word for word dialogue. I would say, again, it's probably hard to compare, but I know you're familiar with David Lean. And David Lean, of course, was probably one of the greatest of the British filmmakers, definitely in terms of the post-war era. He's, of course, made Lawrence of Arabia and Dr. Zhivago. But, again, Zhivago is an example of a film based on a book. But I would talk about Lean's Great Expectations, that is from Dickens, and how he, his vision of how that worked. Again, more infamously, his Oliver Twist. And the Fagin character and other things. So David Lean, I think, had it right. I think this film, maybe Huston's age had something to do with it. But I think the film suffers because of it. It would have been much better had there been, here's O'Connor's vision, and here is the film take of that. Otherwise, just read the book. You know what I'm saying? Just read the book. I'll get it. Two stranger Southern films I don't think were ever put together before, but I think it's if you want to get your South dose, pick your poison over there. And I guess I should say, y'all come back now and just watch yourself on the way out. Be well. Thanks for joining us for another episode from the Yeshiva of Newark at IDT Podcast. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app so you don't miss a single episode.